Hi there. My name's Josh Muller. I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm the president of Melbourne Bisexual Network, here to talk with Megan more about bi stuff.
So I'm Megan, and I am the VP of Melbourne Bisexual Network. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns.
Today we thought we would talk a little bit more kind of past the 101 of bisexuality, talking about sort of like where is the real fight at? What is the real struggle and how might we approach it? We often see our time spent in discourse in BIPOC spaces, whether it's online or whatnot. I suppose personally, I see a lot of time spent talking about lateral violence and a lot of time spent talking about defining labels and arguing about labels.
This comes up quite a lot, I find, particularly online. So I run a small Instagram account, and it's called The Big Bi Bonanza. And we use bisexual on this account as an umbrella for all multigender attraction. But I still find so often we have these kind of quite heated and quite angry and really uncomfortable debates about language, because my feeling is very much you choose the label that works for you and let other people choose the labels that work for them. Yes, it is political as well as personal, but I feel there's so much time kind of wasted and so many feelings hurt by debating the choices that other people are making. And I think that's a big part of what we struggle with people outside the queer community doing to us. So I also think it's something that I really don't want to be a part of, perpetrating that kind of violence against fellow queers. I don't know. I think that I feel a lot of sadness about it, and there's just so much time and energy wasted there. And I think it's important to be able to have conversations about things, but also just to respect one another, the same way that we want to be respected by non-queer people.
It's interesting what, kind of looking back through history of queerness and gay rights and sexual liberation and things like that, that there have always been arguments about what do we call ourselves and what is the various benefits and pros and cons of what we call ourselves. Like thinking back to earlier in the 20th century, who called themselves homosexual, who called themselves queer, who called themselves gay, and how did that come to be a word that was used much more? Of course, all of these words have kind of like shifted and moved around a whole lot with the kind of emergence of pansexuality, as well as lots of different kind of very specifically described sexualities like omnisexuality or polysexuality, using these different word bases to kind of get closer and closer to an exact description of what someone feels or how they behave. I'm partially concerned that a lot of time is spent on it, and a lot of kind of ink is spent on it, or digital ink is spent on it, when that actually isn't reducing biphobia in the world and isn't improving people's lives particularly.
I think it often aids to further separate us when I think a lot of multigender attracted people have the same kinds of battles. So I feel like, irrelevant of whether you call yourself pan or poly or omni, and more power to you for choosing a word that you feel fits you better. I think that there's huge power in that, and the autonomy to get to decide how you want to self-define. I think that's a crucial part of our liberation and of our freedoms. And I think I just feel that sadness when somebody wants to be able to do that for themselves, and then also to critique other people's choices. I think, I love this whole, let's look at the bi umbrella and let's look at what it means to be multigender attracted in general, and think about how we can work together to fight some of these battles which a lot of us are facing in slightly different ways, definitely, but ultimately quite similar problems. And it's not that I want to erase anybody's specific experience at all, and I think I really believe in finding things that work for you, even if other people don't understand them. But I think, how can we work together rather than feeling like there's all this infighting about nuance, because language is imperfect and always changing and means different things to different people. So I also think my pan might be very different from someone else's pan, and your omni might be different from your friend's omni, and that's also okay. So maybe we can talk about those things and discuss them. I think that can be really interesting, but with a bit less hostility and a bit more openness to the fact that people are going to feel differently about the things that you feel strongly about, and that's okay. Like, I think that's part of what's beautiful about being queer, is it's a humongous wealth of wildly different experiences, and I think that it's really wonderful to be in that group of people and see those differences as strengths as opposed to things to fight about.
I think that really makes me reflect on where is the shared ground between, say, bi plus people and gay people, or bi plus people and lesbian people, that there is so much shared ground, and it's really useful to address the biphobia that is within monosexual communities of like gay or lesbian folks. And also, I worry that we spend kind of like too much time on it, or a greater part of time on it, because we are part of LGBTQ communities and spaces, and so they're around, like they're there for us to talk to, and they're at the parties that we go to, and they're at the conferences that we go to, and so we end up talking to them much more. Whereas actually, the vast majority of biphobia, and also just straight up homophobia or transphobia or cisgenderism that bi plus people experience, is from straight people and cisgender people, and from the mainstream. And this is what I heard Shiri Eisner was talking about a few weeks ago in that interview as part of the Stand By Us conference, that talking about, well, yes, the word monosexism can be useful to think about bi plus specific experiences and biphobia, but actually it's sort of like a fool's errand to end up driving to use it as a wedge between bi plus people and gay and lesbian people.
Yeah, so much so. And again, I think it comes down to this: we enact violence on one another because we've had violence enacted on us. And we talk about it a lot within queer community. I think there's kind of lateral violence in how we hurt one another because we're hurt. And I think so much of bi plus people's pain comes from that feeling of you've already been rejected from the kind of the mainstream normal society, which you feel like you can't fully access because there's part of you that never fits there. And then there's that greater rejection if you're then rejected in queer spaces. And I think that's what a lot of it's about, is it's like it's pain. It's just a way of, like, we're experiencing pain, we've already been rejected, and you get another rejection, you feel like, oh, where do I go now? And I think there's, definitely like nothing to be gained from fighting within queer community about it. I think, yes, we learn from one another. And I think that's one of the things I love most about being queer, is I've learned about people's experiences which are wildly different from my own. And they've given me a much greater empathy to understand things. And I think that, I have zero desire to fight with homosexual and lesbian folks. Like, they're my peers. They're the people who often understand parts of me that cishet community could never understand. And yes, we're different, and we have different battles and different struggles, but we are all outside the things that we were taught to be and the things that we felt pressured to be. And I think we all experience shame. We all experience those hurts, and fighting within ourselves only kind of serves to deepen those damages. And I think, I see so much more strength in being a beautiful technicolor range of everybody under the whole LGBTIQ plus A spectrum, and all the wonderful letters that maybe aren't in there yet. I think that's glorious. It's one of my favorite things about being queer. And I hate to see that kind of the fighting. Yes, talk about things, and yes, address stuff, but let's be a bit less angry and violent towards one another, when ultimately, like you say, the reason we're hurting is the bigger picture. It's not most of the time what's going on between ourselves. I think that's just a knock-on effect of the bigger hurts, to be honest.
You mentioned, like, where did we learn these things? Where did we learn biphobia? Where did we learn monosexism or homophobia? I actually think a lot about the role of schools and education systems for teaching teaching kind of the world of multigender attraction as well as kind of queerness in general, and a bit about the role that schools and sex ed really have to play in that.
I think a huge part of what's so difficult about that is the fear of, families and parents often, that somehow you're corrupting minds by talking to them about what's out there. And again, I think there's so much to be lost in that, because I don't feel like knowledge can be a bad thing in these contexts. I think if anything, all it does is give you a greater permission to find out who you actually are, as opposed to how so many people feel, which is funneled down very specific paths with no room to maneuver to find out their truths, I suppose. And yeah, I'm a very big believer in education and talking to people young. I think children understand infinitely more than often we give them credit for, and often far better than we do as adults, because they're far more flexible and malleable. I used to be a primary school teacher, and I think it's something I feel really strongly about still, and sex education is something I feel hugely passionate about. And you look at places like Holland, where it starts younger, they have lower rates of teenage pregnancy, greater access to contraception and all the things which enable you to, again, be autonomous of your health and take control of your life in ways that are hugely empowering. And I think that knowledge is really important for our young people, and just gives them greater permission to, A, not judge themselves, and B, not judge other people. And the world is full of queer folks, so hey, it's probably a good thing to understand about that, and to recognize those things in yourself and kind of to other people. Like, surely that's what we want to raise, is people who want to be kind and look after one another, not people who want to be angry and aggressive towards people who they don't understand.
Particularly kind of zooming in on that kindness aspect, I think kindness comes from a sort of normalization and accepting someone as part of your in-group, or like part of us rather than them. And you're right, that can start so early, and it can start much younger than we start talking about sexual attraction or talking about sex itself or the erotic. That actually we've got to remember, when we talk about bi plus, we are including talking about biromantic. And we actually don't often talk about biromantic as kind of a particular aspect of bisexuality, and if we were to be specific, in truth, they're separate things that often go together, but not always totally. But like, we teach children romance and partnership from a very young age. Like, how young do we start telling children fairy tales? Fairy tales are filled with romance, and every single princess story is filled with romance, and it's always hetero romance and mono romance. So, between the prince and the princess sort of thing. And there's no real sex and sexuality involved in those stories, because, they're appropriate for like 2 and 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. But the romance is there, that romance aspect. And how cool would it be to have a biromantic princess in a children's fairy tale who has romance or romantic attraction and interest in people of more than one gender? And if that were normalized, how much would that do? Totally separate from the erotic and from sexuality.
With bisexuality, as I say, there's always this focus on the sex part. The minute you say the word, it's what people are thinking about. And there's so many layers to what that is about, and sex is a part of it, and it definitely isn't the whole thing. Surprise. And talking about like romanticism and what it means to be biromantic and maybe not bisexual, or bisexual but not biromantic. I think that, again, the wonderful conversations to have about the nuance of people's experiences. And talking about romance, like you say, it's something we talk about so much. It's something that's pushed on us so much in very specific ways. And I think there would be so much to benefit from having more nuanced conversations, because I think that would also lead to talking about different types of like platonic love as well, like being able to be passionately, platonically in love with somebody, or have like those really tactile friendships, which are not at all about necessarily even about romance, but definitely not about sex, but about how you care for people in different ways, and normalizing those kinds of things, like say, men hugging and wanting to be close to one another in the same way that we've normalized that for women. And I just, again, I think there's quite a lot of sadness in that, because you see young children being very tactile and close with one another, and then they're kind of trained not to do that, particularly for people raised as boys. They're trained out of that, as though somehow they're expected not to need that physical closeness. And I think there's so much lost with that as well. I see the damage it does to boys and men and people raised as boys and men. It's really harmful, because we all need those things differently, definitely. And I'm someone who loves physical touch and being tactile with the people that I love. And I know that's not true for everybody, but for me, that's a real intrinsic need that I have as a human. And I know it is for a lot of men and, people raised as men too. And that they're kind of told that that's not something that they should embrace. And it's something they should pretend isn't important for them. And there's like a lot of sadness for me in that. Like, ooh.
Well, and to me then, bisexuality and biromanticism is kind of the missing link, or the thing that breaks down that strict binary of who you're allowed to be friends with and who you're allowed to date, and what does that mean about your gender. So for men and boys are taught at a certain point you are not allowed to hug your male friends, and even like whatever level of affection you show towards your male friends could be construed as being gay, and that gay means effeminate or less manly is like part of the kind of system of hegemonic thought in the mainstream. And so from that, it says, well, you have to avoid that at all costs, and then drives them towards this kind of hyper misogynist and hypersexualization of women in order to kind of prove their masculinity. But if we were to really deeply teach bisexuality and biromanticism as a normal thing that happens in the population and doesn't really necessarily need to affect your gender or your gendered expression. People of all genders and all gender expressions are bisexual and biromantic. That actually gives space for like a young boy or a teenage boy, say, to think, well, I can be attracted to women and I can be attracted to men at the same time, and that doesn't change my level of masculinity. And if everyone were to understand that, then I think there would be way less pressure to separate the binary kind of like masculine men and feminine women sort of.
Just allows for nuance, doesn't it? And I mean, that's what it is to be a human, is to be nuanced and have different aspects of you that aren't what you've been told. And yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling thinking about it, isn't it? What would it be like if you were told you could just be yourself in all these different ways and allow yourself to feel the things you feel, rather than censoring them, or just pushing them down because you feel like, oh, that's not something I'm supposed to feel, so I'm just really not going to look at that. Which I think is what so many young people do, and I was definitely one of those people. There are things I felt which I was like, oh, I can't face feeling that. Like, what does that say about me? So I put it away, and you realise putting something away doesn't make it go away. About how much do you miss out on because you think that's not something I'm supposed to feel, that's not something I'm supposed to do. Just how many parts of yourself do you miss looking at and kind of freeing? And like you said, the knock-on effects of it are huge for all of us in very different ways, and I think we're all damaged by these restrictions very differently, but we're all damaged by them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've very strongly relate to this idea of just giving people broader be human and to relate to other people. You offer them space to more fully explore who they are and to more fully accept other people. And I think that surely they have to be good things, which make us better and make us better at caring for one another and better at caring for ourselves.
And that kind of nuance and kindness and empathy, like if we've been talking about kids and teenagers growing up into young adults and into adults, having a kind of deep understanding of bi plus means that you're looking at couples and you're looking at relationships and thinking of them not just in terms of what you see on the face of it, which might be two men or two women or a man and a woman, and kind of like guessing from there. But having that deep understanding brings in time. So thinking historically that that person might have dated people of the same gender or of different genders throughout their life, or may well in the future, and that that's okay. It also brings in the sort of interiority of attraction that you can't see or you can't guess unless you actually ask someone. That you can't guess someone's sexuality just based off who they're dating. That is actually quite a radical statement and a radical rewiring of what we've been taught and what we assume. It's just like the kind of rewiring around gender of saying, well, if non-binary people can express their gender in any way, then you cannot guess someone's gender based off how they express themselves. What a shattering of the kind of basic rules and laws that many of us have been brought up.
I think the radical is the right word, and I think the biggest thing it serves to do is to challenge our assumptions. And I think that one of the best ways we can move through the world and do less damage is to assume less. And I see this, again, like I think this is a real strength of bi plus folk, because we feel those assumptions often and feel ourselves erased or feel ourselves not seen for who we really are. And I think it really does serve to make us challenge our own assumptions. And I know for sure it's made me way more like self-reflective on the assumptions I make about people I know nothing about. And yeah, like part of being a human is assumptions, and you know it's ingrained in our biology to do things to keep ourselves safe. But it's also, we have moved also beyond that. And I think it's important to acknowledge our capacity to challenge our own assumptions and to not push them on other people. To say, oh, maybe this is what I would assume about these people, but hey, that might not be the case. And to question the things that I am choosing to think I know when I really don't. And I think it's really lovely the more you start to do that, because it just makes everything a lot more expansive and a lot more, I don't know, just a bit more, spacious and honest, and allows room for people to be, as opposed to disappoint you or surprise you. Just lets them be themselves and maybe gently unfold, as opposed to, because I felt that sometimes it's like other people make these assumptions about me, and then I have these unspoken pressures to live up to them. So I'm like, oh, this is what I thought. So then I feel like I'm disappointing them if I do something different, and that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody as well, I feel. Just questioning that a bit more and challenging those things in yourself, I think, can change kind of everything, really.
Unlearning that kind of hetero norm means that, say, I don't know, obvious, like with celebrities and things, and with politicians to a lesser extent, there is kind of this strong pressure on them to be extremely open and naming of their sexuality. And like that absolutely has a political power when a celebrity comes out really publicly as I'm bisexual or I'm pansexual, and then like has a platform to talk about some of those issues. Sure, that's got power. And if all of us were to sort of really genuinely unlearn that hetero norm, then we would be able to believe in our mind this person may be any sexuality and not assume that they're heterosexual until they name otherwise, but actually to really consciously create that open space around sexuality or romanticism or attraction, so that rather than assuming they're hetero until you know otherwise, or assuming that they're gay if they have a same-gendered partner until you know otherwise, purposefully keeping a blank space for them to feel if they want to and not feel like we have ownership over that or the right to know.
Just this element of that we owe it to people to reveal these parts of ourselves, and I think, like you say, there can be enormous power in that, and I think I love when people in the public eye do that, because it really does support our communities. But I also think there's this huge pressure on that, isn't there? And this huge expectation that it's our job to loudly be ourselves. And I've been talking more recently about like the quiet bisexuals. Like they're very much not as valid than anybody who's noisily shouting about it from the rooftops. And I think sometimes we can forget that. We can almost praise the people who are loudly talking about things and forget that there's plenty of people living their lives quietly, being bi plus, and that's beautiful and valid, and we don't owe all of these parts of ourselves to other people. And if we're in positions where it's possible and safe for us to do that, wonderful. But also, it's okay not to. And I think sometimes we can forget that, and because we're still battling, and I think like we see that in in a lot of the statistics of how bi plus folk are struggling, we are still battling to be more visible, to exist more publicly. So I think it really matters, and I admire hugely the people who are comfortable and able to be loudly themselves. But I also really admire the people who are quietly being themselves and living their lives and trying to understand these parts of themselves without ever maybe talking to anybody about it. Like, I think that's really important to acknowledge that.
How many people do you and I know on boards or heads of organizations or clinical leads or seniors within queer orgs who are multigender attracted, but not particularly loud about it? They're not waving the big bi flag about it, but are involved, contributing, doing incredible work, living their lives. But I've heard from so many of them, look, I don't publicize that I'm bi, or like, yes, I've been attracted to people of all different genders in the past, but I call myself gay, or I don't call myself anything because it's easier. And like, part of me is sad about that, because I wish they felt able to take pride in the bi plus, in a bi plus label, or in kind of like being safe enough to be out loud and proud as multigender attracted. And there's heaps of reasons why they might not be. But also, they are still a multigender attracted person doing great work within queer communities or out in the mainstream.
Yeah, I think it really matters to acknowledge kind of both of those parts, isn't it? I think it's this thing of holding multiple emotions about the same thing and accepting that that's true. Yeah, I can feel huge sadness about it, because sometimes you see that they could do these things and it could have this impact on all these people. And like I said, it's also a huge pressure to put on an individual that you're supposed to do that somehow for the greater good. And yeah, like we're not always in positions to do that, and we're not always capable, we don't always want to. And I think that's also okay, isn't it? That giving people space to be themselves. Like, I know people who definitely publicly identify as homosexual or lesbian, who are multigender attracted, and also that's not something they want to talk about. It's not something they want to own more publicly. And also, like, that has hurt me at times in the past. I think I've felt there's like, a sucker punch of, they don't want to identify like I do because they see it as something shameful, and maybe and maybe not. And I think as well, like, it's that giving people space to self-identify, like coming back to that language, and that's not about me, how someone else chooses to do that. And I need to have that space for them to be themselves in the way that's right for them at this point, just as I hope that they'll have that space for me to be myself in the way that I've come to. Yeah, and it can be uncomfortable, and like you say, it's complicated. But I think it really matters to respect one another in those ways, and to have space for those differences, and that none of us know what it feels like to be other people, their experiences. And I understand why people don't want to publicly identify as bi, plus sometimes I very much understand that. I know I didn't for a long time, and I understand all those pressures to not be this way. So, it'd be pretty foolish of me as a person who's struggled with those things to shame someone else for feeling them, or for just not wanting to claim those things. Or I know it's complicated, and I'm so conscious of I don't want to be critical of other people, and I also think it's this thing that we all do impact one another as well. So it's a complicated notion, isn't it? How can we support one another and also do what's right for ourselves? We can't always do both those things always.
It is useful to think about what are the political ramifications and the collective ramifications. Like, I'm totally happy for any one individual to say, no label is quite right for me. So in practice, I'm multigender attracted, or, like had partners of all different genders, but I don't want to pick a label. Like, any one person, that's totally fine for them to do that. But the end result of if like almost everyone does that, then that means that, well, what name do we call a group that fights against biphobia? How do we collectively organize? Like, how do we get people to march in a parade? How do we get people to come together to put together resources or fight together, or like apply for grants or things like that, if there's a whole lot of people out there that just aren't using the word? And that's, as you say, the kind of weighing of the personal and the political and the individual and the collective that are offered attention. Something that I'm really proud about Melbourne Bisexual Network's work is in creating space and creating warm, welcoming and kind space that sometimes involves education, sometimes involves just like social stuff, sometimes involves discussion groups or things like that, to create space for people to explore and also to generate pride in community, and kind of like spread that out, this multigender attracted pride, this bi plus pride, so that people kind of get a whiff and maybe get some curiosity or some reflection.
Speaking as a person who found out about them because of some very loud bisexuals, like, I'm very grateful to the noisy ones, and because they enabled me to access this wonderful thing which I might not have found had they not been loud. And yeah, for me that's been life-changing, and I know that it's been life-changing for a lot of other people as well. And some people having the courage and the privileges definitely too, because it's often related to how we move through the world anyway, but that has huge impact. And I see the trickle out of NBN and like the online communities, the events we've put on, and the number of people who find us and like, oh, I didn't know this existed, I didn't know I could feel this way. And yeah, that's one of the most wonderful things about it, isn't it? Is connecting people and making people feel less alone. Like, I see so much of what we do is getting emails and just affirming to people that it's okay, that they are how they are, and that they're bi enough, and that it's good to be who they are, and it's wonderful to be who they are. Like, that's really important work, and kind of someone has to poke their head up for that to happen. And yeah, I think it is hugely important to acknowledge that, and the courage it takes to be one of the early people who says, hey, I'm bisexual, and allows the other people to find them. Yeah, it's something I'm very proud of, being a part of an organisation that does that and uplifts people and helps cultivate pride.
Thank you, Megan, for your time today. It was really great talking to you, as always. And hopefully we can kind of continue these conversations. And if you're a multigender attracted person out there watching this or listening to this, we want you. Join in the conversation. Let us know what you think about some of the things that we talked about today. I'm sure we probably messed up some things, but we'd be happy to, explore things, have conversations, and yeah, kind of develop this in community.
Definitely share your difference of opinions. Call us in, and I'm always really happy to discuss how we can do things better as well. I think, like, I recognise I'm a very flawed, multifaceted human, and I'm always learning to try and do better. And like we all are, there needs to be that room to be flawed, to be learning.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.